Good afternoon and welcome to the World Affairs Council Upstate and our event on policing styles. Does Europe have a better model? Today's event is brought to you through this nonprofit organization. We've been here for about 23 years now, serving the upstate of South Carolina. Our mission is to engage you globally, to make all of the interesting issues from foreign policy to global education, international business, relevant to what we experience here at home. As a part of that, we bring these distinguished speakers to give you the most fact-based, non-political, non-partisan perspectives that we can, and we encourage you to ask your own questions. To do that today, please type your questions into the chat feature. Our moderator will give them to our speakers and allow for a good flow of conversation among everyone. Why is this topic so important? Well, I'm sure everyone here knows about the unrest going on, not only in our nation, but around the world. And there are a lot of questions regarding how our law enforcement officers police. What training did they receive? What oversight did they receive? Well, in a nation as large as ours, that really varies. It varies geographically. It varies based on economics. It varies on a lot of different factors. And some of those topics will be addressed. One thing that's really interesting is looking at how traffic stops and the recording of data gathered there can really show us the pattern of how people in our communities interact with police. That's the most likely time we are to have an unintentional, perhaps, interaction with law enforcement. So as we get started today, please don't hesitate to feed in your questions to us, and we hope that you'll have a great conversation. To begin, I'm going to ask Mr. Rob Rowan, who is chairman of the World Affairs Council Upstate, to introduce our speakers and moderator. Rob?
Welcome, everybody. I tell you, I am impressed and really excited to hear what these speakers have to say. I try to cut their bios down a little bit. And I did, but I'm going to read through this because I think it's relevant when you learn about what they've been doing, what their background is, and I think you'll see. It's interesting. So let me start with Dr. Paul Hirschfield, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at Rutgers University and an affiliated professor in the program in criminal justice. He earned his PhD in sociology from Northwestern University, and his research is focused on expanded criminalization and surveillance in American society. And in that connection, he has also studied the intensification of surveillance and criminalization in American schools. He's currently focused on efforts to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline by expanding non-punitive disciplinary alternatives and understanding and variation lethal policing and police accountability across countries and police agencies. In recent years, he shifted his focus from criminalization to decriminalization and non-criminalization. With respect to decriminalization, he's written on expansion of positive and restorative alternatives to exclusionary discipline and school-based arrest. With respect to non-criminalization, he's currently studying the social, political, and legal dynamics to explain why on-duty police violence really leads to criminal charges. And I could share all the different journals he's related to his profession he's appeared in, and they're impressive, but I would just garble them. So you're just gonna have to take my word that he is well appreciated in the community. Next, we have Kelsey Shoub. Excuse me if I got that wrong, Kelsey Shoub, I think, is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of South Carolina and faculty affiliate at the Center for Effective Lawmaking. The professor's research and teaching interests span American politics, public policy, and methodology. Her work most specifically examined public policy process, race, and policy, and framing, and also using text analysis, machine learning, and big data. She is a co-author of award-winning Suspect Citizens, What 20 Million Traffic Stops Tell Us About Race and Policing. 20 million, okay? Suspect Citizens examines racial disparities in policing in North Carolina following a traffic stop, potential sources of those disparities, and potential policies to address them. She's also published in Politics, Groups, and Identities and has earned her PhD from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She did undergraduate work at Ohio State before becoming a faculty member at South Carolina. and she was a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Virginia with a Center for Effective Lawmaking. Again, incredible reading these bios. And our moderator today is our own Captain Stacey L. Owens. He has a master's in criminal justice from Anderson University and a graduate from both Southern Police Institute, the Administrative Officers course at the University of Louisville, and of the Senior Management Institute for Police at Boston University. Although recently retired as captain for the Greenville Police Department with 27 years of experience, he continues to serve his community. He served over 19 years of that in investigative roles, and the majority leading the Professional Standards Division, which is called Internal Affairs, which we've all heard of. Stacey was the law enforcement liaison to the City of Greenville's Public Safety Citizens Review Board and the department's first intervention team coordinator. Police officers' response with mental illness crisis, and most recently after retirement appointed to the Citizens Advisory Panel on Public Safety. He also was at our, the Rotary put on a great conference on these issues, and he was there and did a great job. He serves on many boards. He's employed at the Sphinx Company as the Director of Community Engagement, and we're really glad to have him here and help manage this discussion. So with that, I want to hand it over to, I think, Dr. Paul Hirschfield. I think he's going to start this whole thing going. And thank you for coming. And remember, any support you would like to give in putting on these events, we would always appreciate. So go to World Affairs Council Upstate, our website, and we'll be glad to have your help. And with that, let me hand it on.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Kelsey Shoub. I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. I have a few slides to go with my opening remarks. Hopefully you can now see my screen with suspect citizens up there and the title slide. So what most of my research looks at is actually looking at how traffic stops can tell us things more broadly about policing in the United States, where a lot of this is focused actually on North Carolina, that one Carolina up, but has also started like generalizing across the United States as more data on traffic stops has become available. One thing you might ask yourself is, why am I spending all of this time studying traffic stops, and why should you care about them? You should for two reasons. One, some of the highest profile incidents that have gained a lot of public attention, spurred on some protests, and is where a lot of the policy changes that are going on are centered around, were initially started out as traffic stops, such as with Philando Castile and Sandra Bland. And then beyond that, and I think as Tracy already mentioned, traffic stops are actually the most common way we'll involuntarily come in contact with the police. So it's a police initiated contact, rather than, say, if like we have a car accident or someone like breaks into our house or something, that would be citizen initiated contact with the police. So this is the most common way we're actually going to come into contact with them, have some sort of experience with it. As a result, I think it's a very, very important thing to understand. Just like the baseline starting out point, and where I come at a lot of this, is looking at the racial disparities and what happens following a traffic stop. And so one thing to just know is that there are widespread disparities in what happens after you're stopped, in addition to who is stopped. So after you're stopped, Black drivers are searched at a much higher rate than white drivers, where this vertical line right here would indicate like where equality is, so that white and Black drivers are searched at the same rate. Everything over here, where almost all of the mass of that figure is, indicates that most of the time there are disparities. And where this information is coming from is from multiple states, and from a paper that I published in the Duke Forum for Law and Social Change. The other bit that is important here is to like just be reminded that these racial disparities are not just like a Southern problem, like some people sometimes point them to be. Rather, they're just systemic across the United States. So this isn't just like a Southern problem, but a national one. Given that, you might ask, why do we see persistent and widespread disparities? especially considering that the premise that I think a lot of us come to or grew up understanding about the police is that the police are there to protect and serve their communities, which in turn means that their goal is to reduce crime. The implication here is that to do this, the police want to, when they encounter suspicious or threatening individuals, groups, and situations, they should do something. And what that has meant for people who are trying to tackle understanding where these disparities come from and what kind of policies might interact with them, there are two big camps as to like where they come from. On the one hand, there's individual biases, which might be implicit, so you don't really understand that those biases exist. And on the other hand are explicit biases. So, and that's something more like you would think of in terms of like traditional racism. On the other hand, there might be like systemic or systematic and structural sources of those things. So decisions that like the higher up brass might be making that unintentionally or intentionally exasperate these things. So in terms of source one, so let's assume that everyone on the police force is really just invested in protecting their communities, serving their communities, which means they're putting themselves in positions or areas that are going to lead to uncovering that suspicious and threatening behavior. Even in the most altruistic version of this, there still might be biases that come in because as people, we use heuristics to kind of indicate like what we should be doing more quickly, because there are a lot of scenarios where we don't have a lot of information or we don't have enough information directly in the moment. And that's where these individual biases come into play. This has led researchers to ask, could there be bias in who is viewed as suspicious or threatening? There are two types of individual bias that I've already mentioned. So one is explicit or like traditional racism. So you explicitly think different groups are going to behave differently and then judge and act based off of those assumptions. And then there's implicit, or that which is not conscious. In the US, folks in studies have repeatedly found that we, both white and Black Americans, view Black bodies as more suspicious, more threatening, and more criminal, regardless of whether or not they are more criminal or more suspicious. This has led like one area of work in this area from like the law field has given rise to something called means of suspicion. So emphasizing essentially that young Black men are going to be more likely to be searched and viewed as threatening than others. So if this is going to be true, what we would see is that these disparities in outcomes based on age, race, and sex, and that these disparities should increase when officers have more discretion. And that's what we do see. So this figure is from my book that's looking at North Carolina specifically, but you can kind of replicate this wherever you have that kind of data, where you see that Black men are more likely to be searched following a traffic stop than white men, Black females, or white females, and that like men, generally speaking, also are more likely to be searched than women. Additionally, if you break it down by whether it's more investigatory in nature, like a traffic stop versus like a safety stop, so someone's gone 20 over, that's not safe for anyone, that's what we would call a safety stop, you're going to be more likely to be searched in those circumstances, and those differences between white and Black drivers are exacerbated, so that disparity grows when officers have more discretion. In response to this, you might be asking about like, what about rates of criminality or the local context? That might actually be what's pushing all of these racial disparities. If you look at differential rates of criminality, so like whether or not officers actually find contraband following a search during a traffic stop, what you see is that white drivers for most states are more likely to be found with contraband following a search than the Black drivers are, which means that potentially those like rates aren't going on at the correct levels, and rather more white drivers should be searched essentially in that realm. If you further push this and ask like, what about being like a fish out of water? What about the local crime levels, demographic diversity, and other theories that inform how we think of crime stats and stuff? When you control for all of those other explanations, you still see these like persistent racial disparities in policing as it relates to traffic stops. One common response is to this by police forces is to go down the implicit bias training route, which we can talk about more in Q&A if folks want to. And then the other way people have started dealing with it is instead taking steps to actually limit how much bias can come in by limiting in certain circumstances how much discretion officers have. On the other side of this is that there might be structural, institutional, or systemic sources born from the fact that departments may have additional goals besides just maintaining safety. So these might be something like maintaining order or revenue generation. And that is precisely what we see. So if they're geared towards maintaining order, or they've been mandated by, say, like the local city council, then there are downstream effects for those racial disparities and just like generally speaking policing patterns. In favor of time, I'm gonna skip some of this. Yeah, so what this means then for how we can address these more structural or systemic sources is a big one is just interrogating what policies actually might be causing these things and then changing them. And one key way that we might start doing this or continue to do this is actually incorporating and listening to the voices of those who are most affected in those communities. The other big question that I often get when doing this is whether it's just like a few bad apple police officers or whether it's the bushel or both. So what is on the screen is essentially a breakdown of what the racial, essentially like suspicion levels are for individual officers from Connecticut and North Carolina, where any dot below this line indicates that the threshold of suspicion to be searched for Black drivers is lower than that for white drivers, so there's a disparity in that. And you can see that most of those dots lie below that line. An easier way to see that is in these two little bar graphs, where you can see that officers have a lower search threshold for Black drivers on average than white drivers, which further indicates that this isn't necessarily like one or two bad apple officers, as some chiefs tend to point to, but rather a wider spread problem throughout the police force that is probably something that is more systemic and so should be addressed by policy changes. So to recap, how I've been approaching this is that there are two general sources or causes for disparities in policing. On the one hand, there are individual implicit and explicit biases, and then on the other hand, there are systemic sources. To address these, I come from a standpoint that procedural and structural policy changes are probably the things that show the most promise in actually addressing concerns in communities and actually getting us to a place where everyone feels safe with the current circumstances. With that, I hope I didn't go on for too long. Thanks for listening, y'all, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion. And I think Dr. Hirschfield is up now.
Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you all for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just start my timer. So I'm here to talk about patterns of policing between the United States and Europe and how they compare. I'm going to share my screen also, PowerPoint presentation, so you can have some visual aids. So unless you've been hiding under a rock over the last year or so, you likely know that the United States has a real problem of over-reliance on deadly force. We really stand out among our industrialized peers with respect to our rate of police lethality. It ranges from 18 times higher in the United States than in Denmark to hundreds of times higher compared to England and Wales. This pattern has not changed despite the clamor for reform. We still have, even though these data are a bit old at this point, the rates of deadly force have not changed markedly at all in the United States. So there are many reasons for these patterns, and I'm happy to discuss several of them in the Q&A. And many of them are completely beyond the control of the police, and that's important to bear in mind. Good policing looks very similar in Europe and the United States, right? It involves being responsive, courteous, knowledgeable, friendly, and there are police all over the country that do their jobs with the utmost professionalism and integrity. Yet these problems persist. And as I said, there are many reasons for them, but I'd like to focus today, in the interest of time, on the issue of training. Police training varies markedly between the United States and in Europe with respect to several dimensions. The first, perhaps most glaring one, is simply the length of training. On average, police in the United States receive 19 weeks of classroom training, followed by field training. In the United States, in Europe, by contrast, police typically spend 2 years in a police academy. In some Northern European countries, they spend 2 years in the classroom, followed by 1 year of sort of on the job with supplementary classroom training. So a total of 3 years of training in many European countries. Given those constraints, that really shapes the type of training that police can receive. Training is typically modeled after boot camps, right, in terms of the lengthy sort of crash course approach. There's much emphasis on avoiding dying on the job, to put it bluntly. Because we have a high prevalence of firearms and shootings and those sorts of incidents, much of training is just geared to making sure that police can go home at night safely. And there's a lot of sensitization to danger, a lot of emphasis on firearms training, defensive tactics. And then the rest of the time is typically mostly spent learning procedures, policies, rules, laws. And then they might have day-long sort of add-on trainings about de-escalation, mental health, community policing, cognitive development issues. And so they are given much short shrift, essentially, compared to what Europe can offer in their 2 to 3 years of training, where essentially European police get academic courses, law, ethics, criminology, psychology, multicultural history and multiculturalism, communication skills, the very things that we would hope that police would have a chance to receive in the United States. And this is, of course, on top of their tactical training and their legal training and everything else that you need in terms of on-the-job training. And then finally, it differs with respect to its administrative structure. In the United States, training is administered essentially regionally or locally. Some police departments even have their own academies. It's very fragmented, decentralized. For example, Ohio has 68 different police academies. They're actually technical colleges or community colleges that host police academies. And they're all under the general regulatory authority of post commissions at the state level, which are staffed by current police officers. And they provide variability in terms of how much regulation, but I would say it's generally fairly loosely regulated as long as these entities meet their basic standards of the state, then they can function. In Europe, by contrast, training is highly centralized. It's typically 1 or 2 national police academies. It would be provincial in the case of countries like Germany or Switzerland. But everybody receives the same lengthy training in national police academies, and it parallels the 2 to 3 year model. So why is training so different in Europe? Well, the simple answer is policing in the United States is hyper-local. It's always been hyper-local. There are 15,273 approximately separate all-purpose local and county police agencies in the United States. So with all those resources invested locally, there isn't a lot of political momentum to suddenly offer millions of dollars in state training. States did not hesitate to step up when prisons were needed to be built, but it would be a political uphill struggle to suddenly provide training dollars at the state level. So when money is invested locally, that puts the cost on local police departments, and they have a natural incentive to limit how much training they can provide to keep the cost down. I realize I'm don't have a lot of time left, so I'm gonna have to speed things up. And so the costs for training naturally fall to local police departments and the recruits, so that's why it's so short. Whereas in Europe, this is national effort typically, and so the money comes from there, and they can offer, like they offer in general for college students, free tuition, and that's how it's set up. So why does it matter that that these differences exist? Well, when you have so much variability, there's bound to be some police training technical colleges that fall short and that fall under the radar of these regulatory authorities and offer essentially shoddy training, espousing pseudoscience. Famously, there's this idea of a 21-foot rule. There's all this lack of attention to the details that you see manifest in incidents where people are tased 20 times because police didn't realize what effects it could have. When you have that, those people doing the training who are not true experts, who just have street knowledge, you can get a lot of misinformation. And it also is an obstacle to reform, because when you institute a new reform, it's on the local police departments to actually train officers in use of that reform, and that cost, of course, falls to them. And so essentially what we have in the United States is police with more responsibilities, right, to handle all sorts of social issues, yet less training, less well-equipped to actually take on the vast tasks that we ask them to. In Europe, police are also tasked with a lot of different things, but they have more training. The other big reason why this matters, in Europe, the training centers are also knowledge centers. There are academics there who do research, and they are under the same jurisdiction as the police force itself. And so when there are new insights generated by research, they can directly translate into new training and into new policies that are administered centrally and enforceable, broadly enforceable. Obviously, there are issues of accountability there as well, but that sort of model doesn't exist in the United States. Knowledge comes very slowly in a very fragmented, unreliable ways. So in terms of policy solutions, one answer would be to offer state academies, like state police colleges. The closest we have to that in this country would be places like Washington that have state academies, except they are still locally funded. The state kicks in about $16.5 million a year, but that still means only about money for about 18 weeks of training. And they're not taught by college professors, but there is a model of guardianship there, which really contrasts with the emphasis in the United States and most academies on the danger of policing and just making sure officers know how to use their guns and how to do proper arrests. This is more about how to avoid using your weapons. All the other alternatives, all the other tools that officers need is really the emphasis there. Another approach, a little more radical, would be to require that anyone who engages, who answers mental health calls, who works in the schools, who works with the homeless, anyone who does that has to have a certain level of training, 2 years or some type of certification. And if the police don't have that training, then you hand it over to social workers or others with that training. This would create an incentive for legislatures and for the police and their lobbying bodies to actually bolster the training that police receive so they can actually handle the jobs that they're asked to do. There are other models. For example, you could, just to wrap it up, you could require that police have bachelor's degrees and in return offer state or federal money to subsidize their salaries to make that feasible. I would favor other approaches, but that's another possibility. And the idea of these policy changes is to incentivize police to offer better training. It's not to punish or make life harder for police who are already strapped too thin. So I'll wrap it up there. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Sorry this took me so long. First, I want to say that I'm honored to be the moderator for this event. You've heard a little bit about me, but I just wanted to add that after retiring from the Greenville Police Department here in South Carolina in the United States, really what changed my career more so than anything is when I got involved, I spent about 19 years in investigations at all levels, supervision, but it was in 2010 when we had an in-custody death that I had just been named to be a part of our internal affairs. And from that 2010 experience, it was really career changing in how we police and how and my whole perspective in looking at everything. And that individual who died in our custody suffered from mental illness. So in 2010, South Carolina was really behind the whole de-escalation crisis mental illness training, and I was able to do that. So I learned a lot from that. And de-escalation, as we all know, is very much a hot topic these days and can be used for a vast majority of everything that we do in law enforcement. So I bring that experience, and I'll do my best to try to direct these questions in the best way that I can. But I just want to say, I too, like Rob mentioned, am impressed with both of our two panelists. And they obviously have a lot of experience, and they both bring some uniqueness. And I want to, I've got a lot of questions that I'm going to try to get with both of them, because they're extreme, a lot of things that goes on in law enforcement, and a lot of people don't think about it. And so I'm glad that we have Dr. Shoub, and I'm sorry if I don't say that name correctly, but and the traffic stops. And I'll just say this, and I'll start with this. In law enforcement, traffic stops can be the most dangerous, and I think in your study probably still shows that is the most dangerous things that we encounter in law enforcement. And traffic stops are for many different reasons. And it's you know, can be for anything from someone calling and saying this person did this, driving this vehicle, to a robbery that just occurred, and it can be misidentification of a vehicle and a person inside, whether it be stereotyping or anything like that. So, and of course, you know, pursuits and all those that come with it. But in your training and your research, what are some of the common problems or common things patterns that you've seen in traffic stops, particularly with white officers pulling over African-American drivers? Dr. Shoub, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I was scribbling down notes. So on the common patterns, and what we've seen are one, or like the three biggest ones, and like who is more likely to be searched or arrested following a stop. On average, they're going to be more likely to be men, more likely to be Black or Latino than white, and more likely to be in that like mid to late 20s range is like essentially seems to be like the most likely age window to be essentially searched, which makes sense to a certain extent, because if I were a police officer pulling over a random car, essentially like young men in their 20s are probably the ones who are going to come off seeming most suspicious, and maybe from both sides potentially like more likely to escalate the situation, which is what some other research that's actually looked into like cameras being on for those stops have shown, is that how officers and the drivers interact also varies substantially based off of the race, age, and gender of those individuals. One of the other things that I've seen in research that I've done and is ongoing is that not only do like driver characteristics seem to shape some of these interactions, but so do the officer characteristics. So for example, in like Charlotte, North Carolina, we've seen in the Florida Highway Patrol, we've seen that like Black officers are less likely to stop cars and then less likely to search like across the board compared to white officers. There's not really a difference if like a Black officer stops a Black driver, but just across the board, you see these systematic differences. And then similarly, actually, female officers are also less likely to stop and search drivers as compared to their male counterparts. Yeah, so those are some of the patterns. I'll stop talking so you can get to another question.
Okay, and in my experience, and you can look across the nation, when we pull over a vehicle, oftentimes the police may not know what's going on with that driver, and many times we don't. And so it's really problematic and challenging for an officer, because we're walking up to pull you over because you may have been speeding, or you did some minor traffic infraction, when in fact the person may think oh, they already know I just, not to say everybody, but I just committed a crime of some magnitude. So automatically when the officer's walking up, or a pursuit may go ahead and start. And many people run from police just on minor infractions. They don't want to go to jail, or they have committed a crime. So it's very challenging for police officers. And I'll just say that. And that brings me to Dr. Hirschfield. You talked about training. And in South Carolina, I think we're one of the very few states that have a generalized, centralized academy training. And that's all I know in South Carolina, but there are some very good pros with that. Everyone, does not matter if you work in a 1-man, 2-man department, all the way up to a 500-man department, you're trained exactly the same way. So you're only as good as your training, but it's consistent, and everybody, doesn't matter where you go to work, everybody's going to do it generally the same way. Have you found in that training study that works better? I know you talked about it a little bit, pros and cons of that.
Sure. I do support centralized training because typically that means greater reliance on experts and science. It's not necessarily going to result in that, but to the extent that it can be grounded in research and you can provide quality training, then it's a good thing. If it's still deficient, right, because it's too short or because it's not grounded in actual science, then I don't know if I would support that. Then maybe letting different places try different things would be better. Can I ask you how long the training is in South Carolina?
It is only at this moment, I believe it's only 22 weeks. But
Okay.
Once you get out of the academy, that's where there's a little difference, and larger agencies, medium-sized agencies have a lot of more leeway, but then you get another 22 weeks of training just from that department. So that's where the breakdown really, a lot of departments can't afford to do that or have the manpower to do that. So that's where the cons are.
Right. I do think it's a structural problem, right? I mean, the fact that we have these 22-week training suggests that we simply don't have the resources at the state and federal level devoted toward providing training that officers need. I mean, why should barbers get much more training than police officers, given the stakes of the job that police have? It doesn't really make sense unless you start looking at it from a purely fiscal standpoint. If you want to look to role models, I don't know much about South Carolina, but Washington really seems to be at the cutting edge with their guardianship-focused model of police training. And also a lot of state police academies offer more extensive training. I'm not an expert in what state police academies offer, but I think that might be a template for moving forward when we look at how do we provide all officers the best training available. Well, you could start with giving them what the state police are getting.
Right. And this is along those same lines as training, but I don't know about the rest of the world here, but for law enforcement, you have a lot, especially when the body-worn cameras came out. You have got a lot of things that you've got to process and really understand and be able to quickly respond. And this is not in defense of law enforcement at all, but if you think about it, I mean, from the day one in the academy, none of the topics that we're discussing now are new. Do we have better training and better technology? That is for sure. But, I started in '92. The Rodney King era was then. So, and automatically at our academy and outside, spent a lot of time with, of course, you have to know the legals and the laws, and then racial profiling, implicit biases. But one of the big things that we kind of lose track of is cultural differences and how to relate and understand that it's not just a white and black issue. There's tons of different cultures that you've got to know and be aware of. And then you bring in, of course, the tactical, the driving, the self-defense, the shooting, de-escalation. I mean, there's a lot to process.
Yes,
and I don't know what the true answer is, but I don't know if you want to add something to that, Doctor.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. There's just too much to learn. you can't cram it all into 18 weeks. I mean, some places it's as little as 13 weeks. And if you're training somebody to be a social worker or a counselor, it's just expected that they get 2 years of training. That we want officers to be professional. We're asking them to enforce the law, to provide counseling, to provide referrals, to take people to the hospital. And as you said, work with people of different cultures, with different impairments. How can we expect them to do that well with such minimal training? I don't know what else to add beyond that.
Okay. And I'm not trying to stay with you. You just mentioned training, but I have a great question here I want to ask. And Dr. Shoub, please feel free to answer this as well. But many people are frightened by the defund the police rhetoric. How do we change the mantra to talk about positive change without the fear of being left without protection from crime?
Did you want to get that, Kelsey?
And I can start talking about it, and I have a feeling you have many thoughts as well. So it's to me one thing that more generally people need to be more aware of, and that I wasn't even like fully aware of when I started doing this research, is how many different jobs the police currently do, or like how many jobs get defaulted to the police if you make like a 311 or 911 call, so a call for service of some kind. Where in other countries and in some communities in the United States, those things go directly to either like social workers or to like an ambulance or something like that, rather than directly to the police. So one thing would just be putting that information out there and emphasizing that it's not necessarily defunding and taking away money from those crime prevention and crime solving type activities, but as rather putting the money where they actually want it. To deliver the services that they are currently potentially unrealistically expecting the police to deliver. Because as you already highlighted, we're currently asking police officers to wear like 20 different hats that would require like 10 years of training if everyone was actually fully trained on all of those different aspects. And that's not going to happen. That's very unrealistic. So we need to figure out different ways to do it. The other thing is I quickly jotted down some of these numbers. So like the New York Times and some other newspapers have been doing some investigations into how time is actually spent by police officers. So like one figure would be like for Sacramento, California, like 59% of the time spent by officers is actually on non-criminal calls, proactive policing, or on medical and other activities, which I think is probably much higher than people actually think. And if on actual violent calls, it's usually on something like less than 10% of the time, and on activities is actually directed towards that. So defunding the police, in short, doesn't necessarily mean what immediately comes to mind, and some of it is just us better understanding what officers are currently being asked to do or not.
I just add really quickly, like everything else, resources are distributed extremely unevenly in this country, and that includes for police. So you have many police departments that are simply overwhelmed, that people have to wait, 2 hours to get a response because they don't have enough manpower, women power as well. So defunding is the last thing those departments need. And many of them would probably be happy if you were to put more resources into affordable housing, mental health care, substance abuse, and all those other things to take some of those things off their plate. So it's a matter of investing in community safety and community welfare, as opposed, I think, to defunding. Some places, yes, as Kelsey pointed out, there's so much time spent handling calls that they really shouldn't be police calls, and maybe those places do have too many police, but you can't apply one size fits all in this situation.
I have one more thing as it goes to kind of training, but it's more about hiring and recruiting. So my last 5 years or so, I was a part of hiring and recruiting. And of course we are in the South, but as I studied across the United States, it was extremely the same, really. And it's very challenging. It's easy to say, hey, you need to feel diversity in your department, and you need to, hire people that reflect your community. And those are great, but it is so challenging right now, especially as of right this moment. There's not many people that want to be police officers. And if you watch the news, and you can see why. But there's things that as a state or most departments, there's things that you can't change. There's certain crimes that you can't hire to be a police officer. If you start adding, which is a great idea, and many departments try to do it, a bachelor's degree, then you're leaving out a lot of people that never went back and have no plans to go back and get a degree, and with the wages that we pay. We tried to reduce marijuana usage. It used to be 5 years, but now it's under 1 year. A lot of agencies are like within the last 30 days, I think, for large. But credit, and then carrying a gun is South Carolina is 21. So there's things, and you have to have a valid driver's license. So there's things that's really hard to get by for everybody. So those are some of the hard things for as a police department. And then again, if you do have a degree, and especially if you're a minority, and you want to come work for a police department, swing shifts, and have a very dangerous job, and feels like when you're working, not a lot of people like you, would you do that, or would you get paid twice the amount and work Monday through Friday with holidays off? I don't know if anybody wants, if you guys want to add to that, that's fine. If not, I'll move on to the next question.
I'll just say that it isn't a problem with an easy solution. One of the points I made earlier could partially address that, which is offering some type of state or federal subsidy for officers with advanced degrees, or even without, right? If the point is to hire, part of the problem is officers aren't paid enough to justify the extra stress and the extra burdens that they have to take on. The other thing I'll say, again, it's probably not popular, but if there is a difficulty hiring officers, given that most of their time is not spent handling criminal calls, there is some potential reallocation that can take place in terms of reassigning school resource officers. I mean, having other people fill those jobs other than officers. Even traffic stops. Most traffic stops don't have to involve a search or arrest or looking for drugs. It could just be giving somebody a traffic ticket. And I know that's controversial because as you say, it's a dangerous situation a lot of the time, but there are people who can do a lot of police work who aren't police. And I'd love to hear from the audience too, and get their thoughts on some of these.
And I'll just add to that. That's a great point. There's a lot of states and a lot of departments who are reaching out to citizens to do like handicap parking citations, which is a great idea, and even traffic accidents, working the traffic accident itself. But I'll move on just for time's sake to Dr. Shoub. I think you can apply this question to your area, because I believe in officers, primarily in the car. And so is the policing style in the USA reactive versus interactive? Community policing encourages interactive partnerships. Do we empower officers to identify and solve problems proactively?
Okay, I can tackle some of that, okay. not all of it. So first, I think like a first premise on that though is that right now we're in a world of like reactive versus interactive, and it's not proactive policing. And in much of the United States, and at least in certain areas of certain cities, there is a lot of proactive policing that's going on. That's where that, like, from the 80s and 90s, like broken window policing kind of mantra comes from. That is all proactive policing, where you put people in those areas and can empower them essentially to proactively interject themselves into different scenarios. And that is also where, if you've seen some of the more recent discussions around policing, you may have seen some people essentially calling for like suburban style policing in the cities. And really what they're asking for is the shift from reactive and community-based policing to a proactive policing style. Where, like, growing up, I interacted with police and them stopping and reminding us small children in the burbs to like wear helmets when we were riding bikes, and giving us like ice cream vouchers. Where I know in other communities, that is not the relationship between officers and the communities. And similarly, more specifically with regards to traffic stops, what we see is, at the very least, on what happens with racial disparities, if you move from a realm of essentially wholly focused on safety to something that's a little more ambiguous, what you see is like racial disparities do go down. And for most people with traffic stops, you don't recover a ton of contraband anyway from those stops. So there is some debate to be had as to like what their virtue is in that like an added investigatory nature, and to a certain extent more studies need to be done to actually see how shifting how we understand and use traffic stops in agencies would actually affect things like overall crime rates in the area and stuff like that. But those are things that police departments and academics would have to like come together to actually start running some of those studies jointly, which is sometimes difficult to get that conversation started.
Dr. Shoub, I'll add that in my own experience. Just looking over the past years, basically what you're saying and what I've heard you say is traffic accidents really very rarely have contraband, unless it's, you know, a DUI, driving under influence, or alcohol related, maybe some marijuana. But as a whole, traffic accidents usually don't really get an officer finding a bunch of contraband like you're saying. That's one point. The others, and at least in my experiences, I've worked in 3 different departments in our state, and one of them was Columbia. But most of the time, the traffic officer, their main goal is traffic citations and enforcement of traffic violations, speeding. So whether they do have contraband, if someone has contraband, it's usually overlooked because they're more concentrated on the speed in itself. So to your point.
Yeah, and that's also, can I say
so I've got getting a lot of questions on training. I'll ask one more training question, I think, Dr. Hirschfield. We were talking about how to better the policing side in training. What can we do to better train and inform the public about how to respond and communicate with officers so that we are looking at changes on both sides?
Yeah. Well, you've all heard about the talk that mostly African-American parents give their children about how to behave when they're stopped by the police. That is valuable training. It's sad that many parents feel the need to do that, but it is certainly advisable. Everyone, and there are certain schools that teach kids how to behave respectfully in traffic stops to avoid antagonizing or scaring a police officer. So I know that maybe the questioner had something deeper, beyond that, a point that was deeper than that, right? That citizen behavior is often what drives police response. Citizens need to learn. However, there are citizens who can't speak English, or they can't hear, or they have a cognitive disability. And by putting the emphasis only on civilians to change their behavior, that doesn't put the onus on the police to actually understand the differences and deficiencies that they're faced with. And so from a policy perspective, I think the focus really should be on the police being prepared and not overreacting, knowing how to interpret when somebody is suffering from a mental crisis. And I really think that should be the emphasis. So yes, the civilians need to know how to be properly informed. And I think one of the issues with the video cameras nowadays is there are people who think that if they antagonize the police, that they're going to have a good YouTube video, or they're going to have a good World Star video. And because we're in a moment of protest, I do think that mentality of being anti-police might start filtering down a little more into how people behave during traffic stops. Maybe Kelsey has seen data on this. I know officers report that they're very restrained a lot of times because they're worried about being on YouTube. But I don't know if there's data showing how civilians becoming more antagonistic in traffic stops. But I am worried about that.
And I will add to that too. That was a challenge and still is a challenge, I think, across the world on that, because in a lot of our complaints, and a lot of people don't realize, a lot of our complaints really were rudeness and the treatment initially of how they were treated by the police officer. But the body-worn camera has definitely helped that. But some of the things that we did in our local area was just really beg people and advertise Citizens Police Academy and have different days for that. And we even opened up our recruiting and hiring process just for people to come out and see what we do and things like that. So those are different things. We even, one of our local agencies partnered with a church on what to do on traffic stops. But one of the biggest things that I used to try to get across to everybody and speaking with anybody, just do whatever, right or wrong with it. If you feel you're in the right or wrong, just do what the police officer asks and request a supervisor either on scene or more, even after that, call and make a complaint. Because the police at that moment, unless another officer rolls up and says, hey, you're out of line here, they think they're in the right. And then they're going to escalate it to whether it's an arrest or whatever they feel. And there's no use in arguing because the police officer thinks in that moment he is right, he or she. And
Right.
so just come and complain. You know, we allow anybody to come in and watch the video. We allow any type of complaints, anonymous, second party, third party, advocates or activists. So those are just some of the things that we do locally.
Yeah, that all sounds really great for what y'all are doing locally. I am hesitant to come out swinging and say that like the public are who we should be afraid of in these scenarios and who really need to change the behavior. I think a lot of the potentially tense behavior is likely driven by mistrust on the public's behalf of the departments, and where we see things like in the national news and stuff like that that might scare us. So like initiatives like what you're talking about sound like they might go a long way to kind of repair at least those internal bonds, which is awesome.
Well, but to your point too, you're exactly right. You get very little participation. We can have community meetings and it's usually the same people in that community that come out. So those kind of things are really, really hard to do. But along these same lines, I have another question for you, and it's really goes along with this, Dr. Shoub. And it says your research clearly shows that the racial disparities are real and systematic. This has created a lack of trust with communities, specifically POC communities. Why is it hard to get a police departments to acknowledge that disparity of support or support Black Lives Matter? I don't see that at odds with law enforcement. Can you help me understand?
Yeah, so a couple points. So I think I just want to clarify that I don't think our research is necessarily driving the mistrust, but rather it is coming to light for those of us, clarifying for those of us who don't live in these communities with these interactions with the police, like why we might see distrust between a local community and their police department, and help us better understand that it's justified and that their experiences are not the same as ours. On the why police departments may not want to engage with this type of research or try and like bury that like their department likely does have some sort of like disparity in treatment either between like men and women or Blacks and whites, that kind of thing, is because when you come in and you say that there are racial disparities in how you're handling things, how a lot of us like gut react to that is someone is calling us racist, and none of us want to be called racist. And so like the initial response to that is to kind of gather together and push back usually, which is like a natural thing that us as humans just do. And so part of that is us as academics sometimes figuring out how to better explain what we mean. So part of that is like some other things have highlighted that like everyone's a little bit racist. So all of us have these implicit biases that are ingrained with us that like we can't really change, like we can't get rid of them. So the question then is how do we handle them in those situations? And coming at it in that from that direction, like I've had slightly better success talking to police departments, and also like starting to break down a little bit of that resistance. But I think that's where most of it lies, is we don't like to be called racist. We don't like to be called things that we identify as like bad qualities. And so it's a question of how to structure that conversation to get us all to a better place. Because I agree that I think police officers would prefer to be trusted, because that makes their jobs much, much safer, and it makes it much, much better. The question is, how do we get there and not alienate everyone along the way?
And I can speak for police officers across the world. You know, it's, you know, right now, especially when an officer works every weekend of handling these protests that are large, and the incident may have happened 5 states away, or you know, all the way across the U.S. You're still called the racists, and you're still called the murderers, and you know, locally in your community, you may have the best department there is, but there's no recognition. You, obviously, you have your community that supports you, but on those days of the events, you're called all of these names, and you're trying to combat, you know, things that could turn into, you know, serious incidents and not. But it is very, very challenging. This is switching gears a little bit. What barriers, and this may be, I know it's not in South Carolina and maybe not in North Carolina, but what barriers and challenges do police unions pose with respect to changing police culture in the U.S.? How can communities help to change that?
I can speak to that. Police unions are primarily concerned about policies and benefits and so forth that affect their members. So that they typically weigh in when it comes to any kind of reform, and they've been serious impediments to substantive reforms throughout the country, both at the local level, state level, even federal level. So yes, changing police culture is ultimately one of the goals, to make police less aggressive and so forth. But I agree with Kelsey that changing policy is imperative. They're not the biggest obstacles to what I talked about today in terms of lack of training. I don't think the unions are standing in the way, but they've certainly stood in the way of civilian voices being taken seriously when it comes to police policy, when it comes to police oversight, those regulatory boards, those civilian review boards. To the extent they exist, they don't offer meaningful oversight because of the impediments that police unions have put in place, either through the courts or through affecting the legislation. So I know that the question was about culture, but that's sort of I can speak to.
Okay. Did you want to add anything to that, Dr. Shoub?
Yeah, it's just tack on that I don't think it's union culture that is necessarily the negative thing here, because that policing culture is there because there's a lot of training there that y'all still go through together, even if it's not like the official 32-week or something like that program, but also like they're there together, instituting those norms regardless of whether or not there is a union present to do so. Unlike the challenges unions may pose to policing reforms is more on the like penalties that can be associated with some of the complaints that Stacey was highlighting in some states, where you can't actually like fire someone necessarily. You may not be able to suspend them. You may not be able to really penalize them. And as a result, it's really just the department that ends up having to pay sometimes a multi-million-dollar or tens of millions of dollar fine. But it's not necessarily a culture that changing or getting rid of police unions would have.
Okay. This is really switching gears here too, and it's predominantly, I would assume that it's a U.S. question, but and how does arming of civilians, gun policies, contribute to how we police? And either one of you can answer that.
I think this is relevant to certainly both of our topics. So I'll let Kelsey speak to the traffic side of things. it makes a huge difference in terms of training. As I mentioned, so much of the training is around the danger imperative. Officers are shown videos of police being killed by guns. I haven't seen studies specifically on the extent to which police exaggerate the threat of being killed on the job, but I doubt they're provided a very tempered perspective on just how extremely unlikely it is that they'll ever even fire their weapons, let alone be shot or killed on the job. But they go into their jobs very much sensitized to the possibility that anyone they stop could pull out a gun at any moment. When you have more training in so many other things, right? When you learn about culture, when you learn about mental health, when you learn about so many other things, and you spend relatively less time focused on guns, then I think that changes the mindset, and officers are less primed for that. But yes, the culture still perpetuates this idea of do whatever is possible to maintain control of the situation, because you never know if somebody's going to do something to you. And I don't know how easily that is to change, but it changes everything, the fact that we have so many armed civilians in this country.
And I'll add to this too, and Dr. Shoub, you may want to add to this as well, but as law enforcement, and I think part of this question too is how do we feel about civilians being armed, concealed weapons permit or open carry. And when our state went to this, it's been maybe 15 years ago, concealed weapons permit. I welcomed it as a law enforcement officer because that person that has been trained, and they're supposed to let you know early on that there's a weapon, and you know that they have very little criminal charges in the past. It doesn't mean that nothing's going to change that or happen, but you feel almost more secure because you know that person's abiding by the rules. It's the people that we don't know, the unknowns, like you're talking about, Dr. Hirschfield, that to where we are trained, and you almost have to be trained that way because that's when it is usually a surprise. And there are tons of videos shown at the academy on officer safety, and that's why I think the older generation of officers have such a hard time accepting the CIT, the crisis intervention. They feel like it's a community thing, hug someone and be more friendly and that kind of thing. But you can use those. That's what I tried to tell our officers. You can use it. Still, we never say don't be safe anymore, but you can, relate to people and bring your own experiences and talk. All my years in investigations, the bad cop, good cop doesn't work. Bad cop, the mean cop comes in, or the detective, and does whatever, accuses and says all this is going to happen. You just shut a person down. You go in there and talk like we were talking today, and you can get so much, more information out of a person, and in fact find out, hey, I was, wrongfully stopped because I would just happen to fit the description, and a cop that comes in automatically accusing would never even get that information. So that's just my points of view.
Yeah, but I just want to add on to this that realistically, in the numbers side of things, at least for traffic stops, a physical altercation is incredibly rare, at least in the state of North Carolina. And I don't really have reasons to think that North Carolina is wildly different than other places. But some sort of physical altercation, either initiated by the officer or by the driver or passengers, happens in less than 1% of traffic stops. The other part of that is if you then turn to what types of contraband is recovered during a traffic stop when it is recovered, the majority of that is things like alcohol and drugs. Because as Stacey said, if you're stopped for a DUI, your car is probably going to get searched because they will probably smell like some sort of booze or other forms of drugs in the car. And you're probably going to get arrested, and thus the car needs to be searched. But generally speaking, weapons are not necessarily the most common thing to be found. Rather, it is drugs and alcohol and sometimes absurd amounts of cash or other weird things in cars. So while policing is a dangerous job, some of this, I think, needs to also just be better understood by the numbers as to when it is dangerous and how dangerous those different scenarios are. And that's ongoing work that needs to happen.
That was a perfect segue to my next question that I had in mind. Since you brought it up, why is U.S. training based around the officer's safety when BLS data on police fatalities show that it's barely in the upper third of dangerous occupations, and if you remove the 40 to 50% of those fatalities that are traffic accidents, it is only average in terms of workplace fatalities?
Well, since you asked about training, I suppose I could tackle this one first. The simple answer for why officer safety is paramount is that officer training is designed and carried out by officers. As I said, these post commissions that exist in every state is dominated by active duty officers. This politicians, experts, academics, we have very little say in how police are trained. So if we had a greater voice, if advocacy groups and others had a greater voice, if you put the ACLU in the room, if you put me in the room, we would emphasize how do you train officers into better protecting vulnerable groups, people with cognitive disorders, people with mental health problems, linguistic issues. If you emphasize those things, then you would see hopefully a reduction in the number of fatalities by civilians, because civilians are far more likely to be killed by police, obviously, than police being killed by civilians. So there's a huge imbalance in terms of our focus on officer safety when that's not as big of a problem by the numbers as civilian safety.
And I don't know the answer to this, and I don't know if either one of you will, but I want to ask it. And it kind of changes gears here. How are European officers compensated compared to the U.S. officers?
From what I understand, United States is relatively well paid compared to Europe. I mean, we're not Switzerland, but the issue is our officers have higher startup costs because of the training costs. So you have to factor that into the equation. They also have better benefits in Europe, of course. There are what are called gendarmeries in Europe that police rural. I think a lot of them are given housing as well. So it's hard to kind of make it apples to apples. My point is, it's not only an issue of pay, right? I mean, there's the job quality and there's the benefits and the education costs.
And I'll follow up with this. Does that improve the outcomes? Does pay improve the outcomes? And, if you ask an officer, of course, we always want money, but one of the things that I learned from research and recruiting and hiring, that money, while it is nice, because we have officers that leave our agency to go work 50 more cents an hour, but the studies have indicated that pay does not improve hiring.
Well, with the caveat that officers who have bachelor's degrees tend to have better outcomes, right? I mean, in terms of excessive force. And so is that because they're better paid, or is it because they're better educated? Probably because they're better educated, but those two things are obviously correlated. They tend to work for the suburban police departments that pay more. So it's hard to know what's exactly the explanation for that pattern.
Okay. We have about, I think, around 10 minutes, and I can ask a few more questions, or then we can just have a conversation, whatever you guys would like to do. But one person asked, is there a difference in effectiveness of new officers compared to veteran officers?
I mean, I could just say with excessive force issues, younger officers tend to use more excessive force. But beyond that, I'm not really quite sure what the effectiveness metrics would be. Maybe Kelsey knows more.
So I don't off the top of my head know. I know, and I forget like which direction this is, but like I do know that the longer you've been on the force is related to like your probability of searching someone and then your probability of finding contraband, but I forget if it's better or worse. I just know it doesn't change outcomes for like women who are on the force longer still behave differently than, or have different search patterns than male officers on the force, and same with Black officers compared to white. So they'll still search fewer people and find the same amount or more of contraband.
Cynicism tends to take hold among older officers, and cynicism has its own problems in terms of productivity, in terms of morale. So I guess you could say there's kind of a bell curve. But yes, officers who are younger are more aggressive, for better and for worse.
Right. And again, it comes back to the training and what you're instilled in the academy. So I definitely agree with those points. You touched on this, Dr. Hirschfield, earlier. One person asked, one area of leadership that South Carolina has led is the use of school resource officers. There have been several criticisms of the use of law enforcement in the schools, particularly around the issues of the theory of the school to prison pipeline. The use of the disturbing school, and let me scroll down just a little bit if I can. I don't have a mouse, so it's a little hard. Disturbing school charge criminalizing youth behavior and identification of children with mental health issues to law enforcement. What is your perception of the school resource officer's role? And I know this was South Carolina specifically, but it applies everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big topic, and so I'm not going to spend the time that it really deserves. I personally believe that school resource officers are not needed in most schools. I mean, most schools do not have crime problems that warrant having an officer on site. And when they are on site, they're more likely to turn problems into arrestable situations. And that's particularly problematic in places like South Carolina, where disturbing schools is technically a violation of the law, you know, if teachers feel threatened by your behavior. And so we saw in South Carolina, many students being arrested and potentially subject to excessive force. I know there was some attempt to modify that law, but I think it failed. I don't know if there was an attempt to narrow it, if that succeeded, if anything's changed in terms of kids being arrested. But where I grew up, you know, maybe I shouldn't overgeneralize, but we didn't have any police in the schools. They do now, and we didn't need them, right? Most schools simply don't need them. And that's the bottom line for me.
Okay. Dr. Shoub, did you want to add anything to that? Okay. And that's, like you said, that's a whole another debate. You know, I think where the school resource officers, at least in the U.S., from the first active shooter, unfortunately, and it began that way. But when you look at how many occurs across, you know, the nation, but definitely valid points. I think this will be the last question, just based off time. And is there any data that breaks out likelihood of violent response associated with mental health, housing, and population density? That is, per capita, is the likelihood of needing police intervention and is escalating to violence higher in urban areas, or is it pretty much even? I'm sorry. Or adjusted for population density. That would tell us how we need to allocate funding if we could do it on a per capita basis. Hope that made sense.
It sounds like a essay question on an exam or a paper topic. I could weigh in, but it would be at the risk of saying something that's not grounded in any research. So I'm gonna pass on that one.
And I'll add something on the mental health, unless Dr. Shoub, you want to.
I'll just add something like very brief, and this is that I think this is an important question, and partially why I think neither Dr. Hirschfield nor myself really have an answer is because data on this hasn't actually been aggregated across the US, and what data we do have is highly skewed. So like we have more information for urban centers because they're the ones who usually have infrastructure on actually collecting it and then sending it to areas, or for like larger cities or towns, because they're the ones who, like in states, were actually required to send this information to anyone in the first place. So the honest answer is we don't know. I think the federal government has started some programs to collect that data, but right now it's not really out there.
And I'll have to say too that just in my experience, mental illness, it does, is very prevalent in any of our contacts on a daily basis across the U.S. But you can't. There's no real way to really get that data, because in one instance, it was to really have any type of crisis intervention, de-escalation, and mental health training. We had maybe an hour a year, but it was 17 years in my career before I heard of crisis intervention training through NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, and which is a phenomenal program. And it's not 100%, but there's been many cases where you deal with someone and there's no time to de-escalate. They're already at the chaos and psychosis, and then there's sometimes that this person has been undetected, or maybe we knew that person had a mental illness but never got diagnosed, never went to any counseling, whether they just didn't have the opportunities or refused to go. And so you learn about their mental illness, especially in a lot of these active shooters, where they were never on the radar of anybody except maybe a few people. And so mental illness is real. I'm glad that police are getting the training necessary, and that it's just everything. There's so many different things that we're struggling with and having to deal with as the U.S. and policing, and it's all very, very challenging.
I just want to tag something else onto that. I agree that it is incredibly challenging, but like this is also partially where some of like the onus behind like the defund of the police comes from, which isn't necessarily actually taking away money from the police, but rather adequately funding other agencies that would be a great boon to the officers, and making it so that maybe you wouldn't have been the first responder in some of those situations that hadn't already escalated to like extreme violence, but
Right.
rather it be someone is going through something, they're going through something, but really what they need is a mental health professional. And like that is what some cities are now starting to do. They've reallocated some of that responsibility away from the police and into social work or mental health professionals.
And exactly. We can talk about this for another whole thing, but crisis mobilization centers, where maybe they have an officer that's, you have counselors, but you have an officer that's in plain clothes just for the safety part of it, or even if they're not even the first responders, because as we know, a lot of people react to the uniform, whether it's EMS, police, or hospital scrubs, because they don't want to go to any of those facilities where they feel confined, of course. So, but this has been incredible. I hope everyone has enjoyed it. And as we conclude, I just want to say that the World's Affairs Council Upstate wants to thank everyone for participating in today's event. The next online event in the America and the World Conversation series is on April 15th at 12 p.m. The panel will discuss the changes to climate policies in Brazil and how these impact us all. For more information and to register, please visit their website at upstateinternational.org. Thank you.